Our guest today is Peter Young. He is the author of Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger, along with The Blue Team. He is a former sports broadcaster who was doing games for CBS, ESPN, Outdoor Life Network, among others. And he's with us to talk about his experience in what he describes as a small cult. And so, hi, Peter. Thanks for coming on.
Dimitri, hi. Thanks for having me.
Tell us what happened, and go through kind of how this started for you and how it became what it did.
Well, I'll try and give you the short version because I could take a long time to explain it. It transpired over 20 years. Basically, I was unwittingly kind of sucked into a small religious cult when I married the love of my life. I was mid to late 20s, living in Idaho as a sports broadcaster, and I knew about this woman that I called her the tall blonde woman. She was beautiful, and hadn't met her yet. And then a friend of mine, when I started talking about her, knew who it was and gave me her name, and then said, "Be careful, because she and her family have this really weird family guru." So I heard about the family guru before I ever met Paige, but we did meet, and we dated, got engaged, and married, had 5 children. And over the course of 2 decades, I got to know the family guru really well. His name was Uncle Robert. He wasn't related to any of us, but he was the classic check all the boxes small cult leader that my wife adored and revered and honored and loved. In many ways, she did all those things that she really didn't have those for me. So I went along to get along and to try and save my marriage and save my family. But in the end, it wasn't enough. She left me for him. And then things got really ugly. And it really kind of had a very damaging effect, not only on me, but also on my kids. And then, everybody that knew me. And so I had been brainwashed for about, 2.5 years. Whereas for many years, I didn't want anything to do with the guy. I thought Uncle Robert was a crackpot. And slowly over the years, I kind of started to come around. And then I was all in for a couple of years. And it took me about a good year after she left for me to really have the Lord open my eyes and ears to see that it was a cult. Because I didn't think it was at first. And nobody ever joins a cult knowingly. They never join a cult. They never know they're in one. I always say you never know you are in one, you only know you were. Because once you realize you were or are in a cult, the mind control's already losing its grip on you. And it took about a year for the grip to be released on my mind.
Well, all of this is detailed very succinctly in your book, Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. And I want to point out that Suzanne read this book in about a day and a half, in the last day and a half, which tells me one of two things. Either it's an unbelievable read that is a page turner that can't be put down, or after 369 pages of writing, it's just way too short. It needs to be longer. But I do want to start at the end a little bit and then kind of work backwards, because at the end of the book, you mentioned that you're still a Christian, you're still religious, and my question here is, what is your take on religion now that you were in this? Has it soured you at all on religion or Christianity at all?
Not at all. Several people have remarked over the years, boy, it's remarkable or wonderful, whatever you want to call it, that you did not turn your back on your faith. And my answer to that is, well, without it, I wouldn't be here. I could not imagine going through life as difficult as it is without a savior, without a Lord looking out for me. So I learned a lot. And really, the inverse is true. And that is that through this process, I learned a lot. I grew in my faith. It was horrible. I wish I could have learned differently. I wish I didn't have to experience all this pain. But there is the biblical idea or theme that the Lord can take anything that we do and screw up and use it for good. And I believe He's done that with me and in my case, which is why I speak out. I had no desire really to air my dirty laundry of my life to people, but cults control their members through paranoia, secrecy, and isolation. So I had been kind of cowed and beaten down for years to not say anything. And maybe if I had, this would be a different story. So that's why I speak out now. That's why I wrote the book.
And even when you were going through the separation with Paige and then later the divorce, from what I remember reading, you were told you couldn't talk to anybody about it. And that had to be just so emotionally debilitating for you, until you finally got that courage and strength to reach out to the support with your family.
I mean, imagine if you can, the worst thing you've ever experienced. Now, during that time, you can't eat, you can't sleep, nobody knows what you're going through, and you're not allowed to tell anybody. That's not a good situation to be in. And I
Why
allowed
were
it.
you why were you not allowed to tell anyone?
So again, you go back to how cults control members. When Paige left me, she was doing something unbiblical. She was leaving a husband who was faithful. I never had an affair, never wanted an affair. There was never an abuse. Before she left me, I think I raised my voice at her once. I loved the woman. So what she was doing was wrong, and she knew it. And I think it was along the lines of, if I started telling people, my friends, my family, people in the local community, they would then say, boy, that doesn't sound right. That sounds awful. Now you have attention directed at Paige and Uncle Robert. And the goal was always protect Uncle Robert. That was always her goal, was he and his beliefs had to be protected at all costs.
Well, two things. One, how do you know that she knew it was wrong? And two, you did eventually tell people at the end, and you got the response that we would all think that you would get, which is, "You're in a cult, dude. You need to get out." So
So I can answer the first question. How does she know it was wrong? Well, number one was clear. It's unbiblical. She knew her Bible. She'd read it. But I can also know for certain by the way that she reacted, and then the plan that she and Uncle Robert, her cult leader, put in place. And so that happened like 2 months after she left me. She told all the kids, and then I went and told all of our children, well, the youngest four of our five. I said, "Listen, I'm sorry. I take all the blame. I wish I could do it all over again. I love you, and I love your mother." So then when Paige found out that I told all the children that I love her, she said, "Well, why did you say that?" I said, "Because it's true." And then she said, "Well, no, it's not true. You only thought you loved me." So that was, of course, in her mind, an abomination that I would say that. And, if the kids know daddy still loves mommy, why did mommy leave? So now they had to come up with cover for what she did. And that cover was, well, Peter, you were a liar all those years. You were never Christian. You were never a believer. You were a liar, a fraud, a devil, a Satan, a sorcerer, and an abuser, et cetera, et cetera. And that all started shortly after she left. And again, I'm certain that this was just simple theological cover
Mm-hmm.
because what she was doing was wrong.
Yeah. And you really became the target, and she was engaging in parental alienation tactics, as you very clearly laid out through there, which is part of that isolation that also occurs with the cults, right? And when somebody tries to leave the cult, um, and if they have children that are still with another parent in the cult, those children are told that that parent who has left that group is the evil one.
Yeah. And getting back to Suzanne, you're reading the book like in a day and a half. I always tell people, or what it usually happens is people can't put it down, or they have to put it down for a break and come back to it. So I say that in to lead into this, that with everything that I wrote in there, all the letters and emails that I quote, so people know it's not a he said, she said, right? I mean, they were so confident, Paige and Uncle Robert, that they put everything in writing. They felt like they had nothing to hide. I had probably in the first draft or two another 20 pages or so of letters and emails that I just cut out because it was too much. Like people who read the first few drafts were just overwhelmed by this. So I have so much evidence of the parental alienation, which really is horrendous to kids.
I got to be honest. I'm glad you said that, because as I was reading it, and you would quote those emails and those communications, I got through a couple of them, and after that, I was like, I just skipped it, because I don't usually get triggered by things, but that triggered me. It was so bad. If you guys read this book, and I encourage you to do it, it's to be the one in it, it must be beyond imagination. But was there any point in time where you kind of got this sense that, and I want to call him Robert Booty or Booty, because one of the things you put in the book, and I like this, is when you started to kind of turn, you stopped calling him Uncle, and you
Right.
started just calling him Booty, which took away his power, and
Right.
that's very important. So I don't want to call him that either. So, um, was there ever a point where you kind of looked at this and they're like, this guy's nuts? And what kept you from saying at any point, dude, like, get lost, like, you're an idiot?
So there were 2 points. Well, let's say two time frames where I recognized he was nuts. One was early on, a couple of years into our marriage. And, he shared his theology about them. The Jews are trying to dominate Christians and take over the world, and casinos are the true churches, et cetera, et cetera. You can read about it in the book. And I remember thinking, I'd look around the room at our little conferences where he would talk, and everybody else believed this. And I thought, this is bizarre. But I didn't say anything because I knew my wife believed it. And I knew if I'd said something, I would be in the firing line. It would not be, boy, Peter, you bring up a good point. It would be, Peter, why are you so dumb that you don't understand Uncle Robert? So I didn't say anything. And then it had kind of had an effect on me. Then on the back end, after Paige had left and all of this horrible stuff was happening, there was no one light bulb moment, but there were several emails that, as bad as they were, and people would read them, you guys would read them, and I would share them with friends and family, and they would see it immediately. And they weren't that alarming to me yet, which is just mind-boggling when I think back and read these emails, how egregious they are. But at the moment, I didn't think they were that bad. Well, I finally got to the point where they started to say that I had imprisoned our children with biological determinism and all of its miserable attachment. I knew that was wrong. And that kind of started the ball rolling.
First of all, I think what you've been through, I could have never imagined going through it. People say in hindsight, there's a lot of things that you could have noticed in the moment. But do you recall when you started having that sense of mind that it was wrong, that you had to get yourself out? Do you recall having a sense of either shame or either fear of having them, Uncle Robert or Paige, coming back at you and maybe having some legal implication, maybe threatening you with some kind of risk that you would take on from your own life? So I guess my question is, was it either shame of sharing what you've been through and what kind of things that you've been involved with, or is it more sort of fear of being attacked publicly by Uncle Robert and Paige?
It's an interesting question, and it's a fascinating question, because the kind of short answer is yes and no. There was shame early on, because that's what cult leaders do. They shame you. They
Right.
control you, to make you feel like you're a miserable person. So there was that. But when I finally started to come around and realize what had happened, there was no shame. I don't know. Maybe I was supposed to feel shame, but I didn't. I was more fear, because as I started to pull away and realize that Robert Booty was not the solution, he was the problem, I still had in the back of my mind this wonderful idea that our marriage would rise like the phoenix and she would come back to me. And, again, you look back now and you think, oh my gosh, Peter, how could you believe that? But I really did. So it was fear, not shame, because I still had Robert on a pedestal. And to go against him, to say, no, you're wrong, this is wrong, was at that moment terrifying to do.
So I guess that goes along with the notion of being brainwashed. At that time, you had no kind of insight of what was going on. Yeah, that makes sense.
And it seems like to some extent too, like you said, you kind of knew, like, what is he talking about with this? There would be times when you would question it. So even though you had him up on that pedestal, like Paige and her parents did, and he was, he was the top man, and what he said went, and he knew everything. It seems like a lot of what you engaged in is just kind of like public compliance, where you didn't necessarily believe all of it that was happening, but went along with it. And it seems like, as you said, to really just keep your family intact and save your marriage.
Well, you had mentioned, I think maybe right before we started recording, it was a massive amount of cognitive dissonance for years that I had to engage in. And it was exhausting. I mean, absolutely exhausting, because on the one hand, in my darkest moments, I would read the Bible, I would pray, I'd be in tears, and I would plead to the Lord, just like, David does in the Psalms, Lord, rescue me. I would do the same thing. And yet, in that moment, I still kind of had the thought that, well, Robert Booty's right, I'm not a Christian, and the Lord's not hearing my prayers, which is just insanity. So that was the worst of it. But I had some of that cognitive dissonance going on inside of my head for years, and it was miserable. It was very hard.
The DSM considers cult indoctrination a dissociative disorder. So, can you, if you can, explain what it feels like to be brainwashed or mind controlled, as you put it in the book?
Mm. Well, again, I would remind everybody that, in the moment, you never know you're brainwashed. You'll never admit it. You are the last person on earth to be brainwashed. In fact, as I started to question Robert, question Paige and her parents, what I kept getting back from her, from Robert, even from my oldest children, was that society had brainwashed me. Society had brainwashed my parents, my children's grandparents. All three of you and I were having this conversation. They would consider us brainwashed by the media, society, government, et cetera, et cetera. So the people that truly are brainwashed are probably the ones that are most adamant about not being brainwashed. So I can't tell you what it feels like. I can only tell you what it's like to look back and read what I wrote, or read what was written to me, the emails that I would have read, and in that moment said, yeah, that's fine. I see what Uncle Robert is saying. I can only tell you now that I don't recognize that person. I do not recognize the Peter Young from 2015, 16, and 17. That's not me.
What's different?
Well, I'm in control of my mind, and I was not back then, but I didn't know it. I can look back and see it now. The best example would be the letter that I wrote, and it's in the book. And Steph, when you talked about shame, that was where Robert Booty was shaming me. I read that letter now, and I'll be honest, it's a little embarrassing, but it's so over the top. I wrote this letter to Robert. I got a month and a half after Paige left me, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to finally get it right this time, and I'm going to confess every darn thing I've ever done in my life, every thought, deed, you name it. And it's a bizarre letter, and it really reads like, maybe somebody that would have written it the night of the Jonestown mass suicide, somebody like that at that last moment, pleading for their life.
Right.
That's what this letter read. And that's what it sounds like to me when I read it 5 years later.
Right. Speaking of Jonestown, besides Paige and your marriage kind of having you hang on to that cult, what was, in your experience, what was a Kool-Aid that was the benefit that you think at that time you were getting from being indoctrinated with Uncle Robert and Paige and everybody else?
Well, Uncle Robert, again, I'll use that phrase. He knew the true gospel, and in addition to the true gospel, many other things. I'll make this point, and I do in my book as well, that cult leaders don't lure you in by just spouting utter nonsense right off the bat. They can at times sound very intelligent, and they'll share things with you that you're glad you learned. There are still things that Robert Booty kind of started me on the path of investigating that I still appreciate: limited government, economics, et cetera, et cetera. And then he would take that and then he would twist it and pervert it to this road that you've been on of investigation that is positive has now gone way off the rails. So much of what he shared early on, I, again, would still appreciate. I'm glad that I learned it, and I still believe a lot of that. But then it would just, again, it kept going down this rabbit hole of wickedness. But the Kool-Aid that you referenced would be that he understood it, and only he did, and there were only few people on earth who did. And wow, look at us. He's our leader. We get to learn from him. Look at how special we are.
And he was profiting off of everyone, from what I understand. Everyone was paying him tithes, and it was interesting as I was reading when you were talking about how he would say everybody has an account with the government and the federal account. And, that struck me as a forensic psychologist. I work with people who claim they're sovereign citizens. Was he along that line and proclaiming a lot of the same things that sovereign citizens do?
Yes, no, I'm not an expert on the sovereign citizen. I kind of have an idea what it's about, but I remember Robert also said that there should be no taxes because we wouldn't need taxes to raise the revenue. I thought, well, hey, I'm all in for no taxes, but where's the money going to come from? So it came from his harebrained idea that all Americans have their own sovereign national credit, which again I talk about in the book, and I really honestly tried to find any kind of material to back it up because I had, been introduced then to Ron Paul, the government, gold and silver, the Federal Reserve, on and on, which I think are legitimate concerns. But the sovereign national credit, I could not find any material anywhere. And you can find anything on the internet. I couldn't find anything that would back it up. But he believed it wholeheartedly. And I remember having the discussion with Paige, 2-3 years before she left me, to where I knew at this point that my doubts about Robert really did not sit well with her. And I remember asking her, like, well, then you explain it to me. What does this mean? And she's like, well, here, look, Uncle Robert wrote about it in this email. And there'd be like this one line about sovereign national credit. I'm like, well, what does that mean? How does it work? She couldn't give me an answer. And I knew in that moment, well, you can't give me an answer because you don't understand it. I didn't dare tell her that. But there's a lot of it, I believe, in cult followers where they think, oh, yeah, we know this theology, this idea. If you ask them to explain it, they can't. You'd have to talk to their cult leader.
Right. Now that you kind of famously wrote that book, and my question, I guess, have you found that more people that you would never expect reach out to you and telling you about what they are going through, and nobody knows about it? I think you mentioned somebody has sent you a book anonymously, and in turn, do you find yourself in a position now trying to help people getting themselves out of their own cult implications?
Well, sure. That's why I'm on your show. Thanks for having me. And that's why I speak publicly. That's why I wrote the book. And a lot of people have reached out to me. So a lot of people, when they read my book, it will trigger something, maybe not often a cult-like experience, but people have reached out to me because it might remind them of a very difficult relationship with a parent or a friend or something where by me divulging what I went through and being open and honest about it, they can relate in some small way, which is wonderful to hear as a writer, right? I mean, I already went through it. I can't change it, right? I suffered and went through all that pain. Might as well try and use it for good.
You mentioned some of the things that Robert believed, but I'm struggling to find out what the purpose of his organization is, if you can call it that, because cults usually have like a overriding purpose. Like Manson, it was to start a race war. David Koresh used religion and power for sex. Oshie did the same thing, the Wild Wild Country documentary they did. Heaven's Gate, they wanted to go to a spaceship, in a sand or something.
Next level, yeah.
Yeah. What was his like, I don't understand the purpose of his organization. What was his end game?
Well, good question. I haven't figured it out either, but I can tell you this. And people ask that same question. A lot of people ask, why did he do this? What was he getting out of it? Well, I think what he was getting out of it was he had a very small but yet unbelievably devoted following of people that revered him, adored him, and listened to everything he said. And we tithed to him. He wasn't getting rich off of us, but we were sending him money. We were supporting him. And that is very addicting. When you have people that are going to treat you that way and put you on a pedestal, it's the rare human with a lot of humility and grace that would say, no, this is inappropriate. He was not one of them. He thought it was great. And beyond that, I don't know. That's my best answer.
Okay. Your book gets dark, for lack of a better term. And you mentioned that you couldn't sleep, and that you went to some urgent care facilities to get sleeping pills. Did anyone there ever say to you, you really sound like you're depressed? Maybe you should go see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or did you ever consider, I think I'm depressed. Maybe I should go seek professional help outside of this?
Well, I knew I was struggling, and but I would have never gone to a psychologist or a counselor on my own volition. Never began that because of what I had been taught by Paige and her parents and Booty. I mean, to go to a psychologist or a counselor would have been the worst thing I could do because now I would be sharing the inner workings of Robert and his little group, and he would have considered that gossip, and I would have been considered a traitor. So I knew all this in my mind. I mean, I read about it in the book, but I just started taking over-the-counter sleeping pills. Like, I can't remember the name of it. You just go buy it in the grocery store for a couple dollars. And I remember at midnight, and I'm pacing my bedroom and I can't sleep. I haven't slept for like 2 weeks. And I'm going to take half a pill, right? You take half a pill, then one pill, then two pills. And I'm agonizing over whether or not if I take this little half of a sleeping pill over the counter, am I now on the road to hell? Because I'm not trusting Robert and Paige and my in-laws because they've told me, just, don't seek help, don't seek a way out and go through it. And somehow that little sleeping pill represented turning my back on everything they had taught me, which is crazy. Again, I can admit it now. It is crazy. But in that moment, I agonized over taking half of a sleeping pill.
Yeah. Since having that experience, are you going through life now analyzing every single interaction that you have, maybe coworkers, a manager, a boss, your own religion, or any other kind of club? Are you analyzing your interaction with people and trying to depict if that person has some tendency of, influencing you or other people? Are you over, I guess, sensitive to kind of cues from people in their characteristic interaction?
Well, that's a good question, Steph. If I am, I'm probably not aware of it. And you would think, well, boy, you wouldn't want this to happen again. And that's true. I would never want this to happen again. But I have never met anybody in my life anywhere close to Robert Booty. Do I know other narcissists and other people like that? Maybe. But no one has ever come close within a country mile to the grandiose sense of self, the narcissism that Uncle Robert Booty had. Not even close.
I want to follow up on the last question about your darkest days, and this is a very personal question. I guess more than we've been asking. So you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But at the apex of the depression, when it was at its worst, did you ever consider suicide? And if you did, how did you get through that?
So I can't remember if I mentioned this in the book or not, but the answer is no. I never considered suicide, ever, not even in the slightest bit. I would say one of the worst moments, and there were a few, I was probably an hour away from driving to the emergency room because nobody still knew. So she left on January 14th, 2017. So it's 2 months later. Nobody knew. So 2 months of barely eating, barely sleeping, and I'm an emotional wreck. And, if you're going through a hard time, you want to talk to people. I hadn't talked to anybody other than the guy that's causing this problem, Robert Booty. And I'm driving home and I can barely stay on the road. And if you've ever had insomnia, it's not just you can't sleep. It is physically debilitating and it is unbelievably painful. And I knew, I said, I can't keep this up. And I knew, and I said, I don't want to check into the hospital. And you want to know why I didn't want to go to the emergency room? Because if I went to the emergency room, they'd start asking questions. They'd want to know why that this local real estate broker has checked himself in the emergency room and can't sleep. Then I would have to answer those questions. And somehow in my mind, I'm thinking the emergency room doctor is going to spill the beans. And now people are going to know what Paige and Uncle Robert did. It's absurd, but that was probably the one thing that kept me from checking into the ER and getting help.
That's, it's like it appeared that the level of control that Booty had, and not just over you, over Paige and then the kids and everyone, like he was everywhere and he would find out about everything. And everyone was kind of in cahoots with him, was kind of the impression that he wanted people to have, which is very consistent with forms of psychological abuse. Very similar to people in domestic violence relationships. Their abusers use very similar tactics with the isolation and degradation and this omnipotence that they have of all knowing of what you're doing, and it'll come back to them in some way, which keeps people there, and it leads to the fear.
Right. And Uncle Robert was never wrong. Robert Booty. It's funny because for so many years, like his first name was Uncle and his last name was Robert. I don't know when I knew his last name was Booty. It was always Uncle Robert. But so Robert Booty was never wrong, right? You could never question him. And that was, of course, what got me in trouble over the years. I constantly questioned him. I would try to ask him, well, what do you mean by this? And so, yeah, in my mind, I was sure that he would somehow find out. He would somehow find out what I've been doing. He'd find out about the sleeping pills and eventually went and saw, a sleep specialist. I went and saw a counselor. I was sure that he would find out. And so with every one of those little steps that I took, again, taking the over-the-counter sleeping pill to finally going to a doctor and getting meds, to then going to a sleep specialist, and then going to the counselor, every one of those steps was terrifying. Terrifying because I was sure Robert Booty would find out and I would be in trouble for doing it.
What do you think? What do your children think of this ordeal now that it's over?
Dimitri, I can't hear you.
Really?
There you go. Now I hear you.
Okay. All right. What do your children think of this ordeal now that it's over?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because I have 5 children, and I always tell people, kind of as a preface of what's going on, is that parenting is a marathon, not a sprint. So my 2 oldest, they're out of college, they're on their own, and they don't have anything to do with Booty, but they believe their mom. I'm the bad guy. So our relationship is strained. Leave it at that. The 2 youngest live with me, and they still love their mom, as they should, but they have a very good understanding of what we went through. They have a very good understanding of what Robert Booty stands for and what he did. And so they get it. They understand it. And the third one is kind of somewhere in the middle.
Okay. Now, the book does end on a cliffhanger a bit, but what happened to Paige? Like, what is she up to now? What is she doing?
It's interesting because when I wrote it, one of the original versions, I said the end. And then my editor reminded me, it's a memoir, so don't say it. You would put that in a novel. So I took it out. And then something happened this summer, which I don't really want to get into too much because it involves my children. But my youngest child was like, Dad, it's too bad you already published your memoir because this should go in it. So I everything that's in the memoir probably ends around we got divorced in 2020. So 2020, early 2021. So now, it's been 2 years and it's not any better. If anything, things have gotten worse between the 2 of us. I have no contact whatsoever with Robert Booty. And quite frankly, I have very little with Paige. She still lives in a different state. And I don't even have her address. She still engages in behavior that I would consider to be very unhealthy. And it's all based on secrecy and paranoia, and I'm out to get her. So it's awful. I mean, it's still an ongoing ordeal, largely because of the children. If we had no children, I wouldn't have probably heard from Paige in years.
There's a story you told in the book about an ogre on a mountain. And with all due respect, I thought that was the best part of the book because that story is so like it with the things that are currently happening in the country. I think that story is profound. Do you want to go ahead and tell it? Because sure. I think for that, it's what's going on now in the country in general. That story is a great thing to mention.
Well, I lifted the story from the book A God Who Hates by Wafa Sultan. It's a fantastic book. It's a deep dive into the life of a a Muslim woman that escapes what she went through and came to America and turned her life around. It's fascinating. And so I don't know if she came up with the story or the story is, kind of somewhat of a Middle Eastern parable, but there is a young man who travels the world and he happens upon a small village at the base of a large mountain. And the traveler notices that everybody in town kind of walks around, shoulders slumped, head down, looks like their energy is sapped. They don't look happy, they look scared. So he goes to the village elder and asks why. And the village elder says, because of the ogre on top of the mountain. Be careful, he's very dangerous. And the traveler's like, well, I'm going to go and find out why the ogre is doing this. Why is he terrorizing everyone in this village? And the village elder is saying, wouldn't do that. It's dangerous. Traveler goes anyway. And as he climbs the mountain, he approaches the ogre. And as he gets closer to the ogre is shrieking and shouting and screaming and trying to scare the traveler. But as he gets closer, he notices that the ogre's tiny. So then he walks right up to the ogre, and the ogre is so small that the traveler can kneel down and he puts his palm out. And the ogre hops up onto his palm. And he says to him, why do you appear so big? And he says, the ogre, I'm as big as people's fear. And it's so true that what we fear, we give power to that thing. And it's so clear that all of the adults in the little cult of Robert Booty are terrified of the ogre on the mountain for various reasons. And so the ogre on the mountain looks different to Paige than it did to me, to my in-laws than it did to me. And I remember having read that book years before I really got it, before I had the strength to climb the mountain and see that this fat little man was no bigger than something that could fit in the palm of my hand. And I had given him the power, and I had given him the ability to seem enormous and terrifying and large. So thanks to my faith and my family and friends, I was able to walk up to the mountain and kick the little guy off the mountain. And it felt great.
Story. Yeah. I want to shift away from the story and the cults for a second and talk about your broadcasting. You were a broadcaster, you were a play-by-play broadcaster. Okay. Yeah, you wrote in the book that gambling and sports make bad bedfellows. But gambling is sports now. The NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, they're all getting in bed with it. ESPN just started their own sports book, which is a disaster, but they're starting it. What's your take on the involvement in gambling in sports right now?
So let me give you, a little bit of history as to why I feel that way. When I was in college, I was a history major, and I did my senior thesis on the 1919 Black Sox scandal. So think of 8 Men Out, think of Field of Dreams and all that. And it nearly destroyed Major League Baseball, destroyed the franchise of the Chicago White Sox, and destroyed the lives of those 9 people. So you're right, Dimitri, that gambling and sports are now walking happily through American culture hand in hand. But it is very dangerous, and I'm still not a big fan of it. And to me, it's just a matter of time before there will be another scandal. There's probably much going on until we find out about it. I'm a firm believer in free markets and capitalism, so go for it. But the reason we find sports compelling is because we believe the product on the field or the court is legitimate.
Oh, yeah.
And the moment money gets involved, it's no longer legitimate. And so it's, like George Washington said, government's just like fire. It can heat your house and cook your food, or it could burn the house down. And that to me is what gambling is.
What's the best and worst game you ever broadcast?
Well, I did a couple of games, college basketball games, where there was either a dunk or the game-winning shot that made ESPN's top 10. And so, top 10 plays of the night. And they didn't use my call. I was so angry. But I was doing games.
How's that possible?
It was Boise State at Colorado State at Boise State. It was like 2 weeks before Paige left me. It was like New Year's Day, and this kid for Colorado State banks into 3 to win the game. It was great, right? And I had the call, and it made ESPN's top 10 that night, and they didn't use my call. So I had a couple of good games like that. And then I got to travel the world as a sports broadcaster, did a lot of fun events. The worst event, I've done some high school basketball games that were cringeworthy. They were hard to watch.
As it should.
Yeah, I can believe that. Okay. I want to get you out on this. I don't know if you notice this, but I don't know if we can agree that cults are sort of having a moment right now. There's documentaries everywhere. It's all over Netflix and HBO. Do you have like a top 5 cult list, like of the most dangerous or the creepiest or the dumbest or anything like that you've come across this?
No, I don't have a list. I will say this, though, as I continue to read, so I don't really consider myself a cult expert yet. I don't know if I want to be one. I'm the expert on what happened to me because I lived it. I was in a cult. I was brainwashed. So now as I read other books about cults, my jaw hits the floor, guys, because you know what? They're all the same. Every single cult leader has so many shared traits. Cults look very different. They come in all different shapes and sizes, but at their core, they are undue mind control, as Dr. Stephen Hassan says in his book. I believe he's correct. And so at their core, they have so many similarities. It's scary.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate you coming on here. We do too. The book is Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. It's on Amazon. It's on any other bookseller, Barnes and Nobles. You can get it anywhere.
Yep.
Okay. And I do encourage you to read it. It's really fascinating. Thank you, Peter. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, everybody, for having me. Appreciate it.